Chapter 16 Revelations. Cemetery restoration leader hit, killed by vehicle in North Broadacre. By Kenneth Ball, staff writer. Broadacre, Indiana. Zane Truax, profiled in Wednesday's paper for his Hauser's Wood Cemetery cleanup efforts, was hit and killed later the same day by an SUV, officials said. At 2:35 p.m., Broadacre firefighters received a call that a man had been struck at the corner of Main and Verna Streets in North Broadacre. The call was placed by the driver of the vehicle, Broadacre Fire Chief Samantha Ellsworth. When emergency services arrived, CPR was being administered by Ellsworth. Truax, 24, was transported to St. Germain Hospital in Broadacre, where he was pronounced dead. Broadacre Police Captain Richard Wiest reports that the incident was likely an accident, and that Ellsworth didn't immediately seem to be negligent. Chief Ellsworth was headed to a demolition project in North Broadacre when Mr. Truax stepped out from between two parked cars and into the path of her vehicle, says Wiest. Truax was wearing headphones at the time of the accident, and a flask was found on his body. Alcohol may have been a contributing factor to the unfortunate incident, says Wiest. We won't know for sure until we receive the results of the toxicology test. Ellsworth is on administrative leave with pay, pending the outcome of the investigation. When his human didn't return, Spooky took the loss hard. It's easy to attribute complex emotions to pet animals, feelings like sadness, longing, and anger, because they can't talk back to their owners and refute these notions. It is apparent to us now, though, that Spooky did grieve for his friend. The first couple of days, everything was fine. Zane had been gone before, but he always came back, massaged the cat's head, gave him a handful of treats. Spooky had vague, jumbled memories of his old owner, Mrs. Glazer. He was called Petey then. That lady used to be his friend, feed him, but she had gone and never came back. By Friday, Spooky was starting to get anxious. Was Zane never coming back? Who's going to give me treats? Who will scoop the litter box? Spooky wandered around in the attic for a while. Maybe Zane was just hiding somewhere. They played this game sometimes. Zane would go behind the tall dresser and wait for the cat to pass, then pop out with a roar. It made Spooky jump, but he liked it. He'd bound after Zane, trying to nip his ankles. Zane didn't pop out this time, though, even when Spooky called out plaintively. Spooky took some time licking his fur clean. Normally that would be calming, but he just couldn't seem to relax. He stood on a chair and looked out the window. Maybe Zane was outside. He couldn't see anyone, and it was getting dark. Was Brock going to be his human now? But Brock didn't like cats much. Spooky could tell. He jumped up on Zane's bed. That was where he liked to rest at nighttime, on top of the blanket between Zane's legs. It was a nice place to sleep, soft and warm. Where am I going to sleep now? Won't I be cold? He lay down and rested his head between his front paws. The blanket still smelled like Zane, and that was somewhat comforting. Spooky lay there all through the night, waiting for his friend to return. He didn't feel like getting up to eat anything. Zane's parents had been called. They were at the hospital when the doctor informed them that their son had passed. Together, they grieved mightily in that special little room hospitals have set aside for families to receive bad news. It wasn't easy for us to watch, but it didn't last long. Resolve soon replaced the grief that had overtaken Shock, and Gregory and Caroline Truax knew that they would have to take action. They made calls. They spoke with some relatives in the area, who graciously offered to drop what they were doing and help with arrangements. There was only one person they could think of who should be told in person, and that was Brock DeKalb, Zane's best friend and roommate. Zane's parents wanted to be the ones to go, but Aunt Tamara, Caroline's sister, and the first to arrive at the hospital, put a stop to that. She knew they weren't in any shape to be driving around, so she recruited Uncle Morris to make the trip out and break the news. We watched Maury drive up that winding, grassy drive to Broadview Manor. He'd seen it from a distance before, but never noticed how imposing it looked, towering over the surrounding hill like a fortress. One side of the house was stripped and sanded in preparation for a fresh coat of paint. He rang the doorbell, and Brock answered. Maury introduced himself and asked Brock to sit down on the front step with him. Then he told Brock the whole story, as gently as he could manage. Brock's first thought was that it was a joke. Someone must have put this stranger up to it. But, as Maury laid out the details, it became apparent that it was real. Brock found himself unable to think. He knew he should say something. Should he comfort Zane's uncle? Should he say something profound? And why didn't he feel sad? Brock was just completely blank. He stared at a shiny black ant dragging a dead ladybug across the step near his shoe. He watched the crawling movement of a cloud. Uncle Maury went on, telling Brock about Zane's relatives gathering at the hospital and that they'd be heading back to the Truax residence soon. He let Brock know that he was welcome to join them, to grieve with the others and not be all alone. Finally, one thought came together in Brock's mind. There's someone I need to tell first. Wisteria was in her window seat, watching one couple in particular who held hands as they shopped. She had seen them stroll all the way down the block, browsing at the bookstore, buying ice cream cones, and leisurely inspecting the menu at Vermicelli's restaurant. Still too early for dinner. They walked on. She wore a flowing olive top with intricate golden embroidery and brown flare-leg pants. Comfortable. Kind of a 70s look. She'd worn these clothes 2 days in a row now, even slept in them the night before. The act of putting together an outfit hadn't given her its usual joy in many weeks. She just needed something to wear and couldn't think too hard about it. Her feet were bare. Wisteria couldn't remember the last time she had worn shoes, actually. As she'd been haunting the tower day in and day out, she didn't really require them. Mr. Hackett had given his only child the best room, the one on the corner of the building, with the Richardsonian Romanesque-style tower leaning out over the public square. It had become Wisteria's sanctuary, with comfortable pillows, a round table for working, even an antique chandelier. Her room was furnished mostly with antiques, in fact. She loved scouring the bargain bins and dusty basement shops around the old city for her treasures. Never mind that most of them didn't fit any theme or even go together well. It was enough that they were old and that they had stories. Someone had owned these items, loved them. If the antique seller didn't know the item's history, Wisteria invented one. She made frequent trips to downtown Broadacre when she was feeling well. There were no old-timers in her father's development, and thus no stories, no curious baubles, no history. In the new city, they were making up the history as they went, but little of it interested her. The people in her neighborhood didn't do anything remarkable or memorable. Mostly, they just complained about perceived slights, or subpar customer service, or things that couldn't be helped, like the weather, or prices in shops. Wisteria's sugar glider, Marzipan, was out of her cage. She climbed up the drapes, hesitated, then sailed gracefully onto Wisteria's shoulder, where she was given a piece of dried pineapple as a treat. Marzi used to have a mate, Oliver, who had lived to the ripe old age of 14. Now Wisteria was all she had. Sugar gliders are social animals, prone to depression without sufficient stimulation and attention, so Wisteria made sure to give her plenty of love. She wouldn't wish depression on anyone. How long had she already been in this self-imposed isolation? Weeks? Probably more like months. It was hard to remember. She was so tired of feeling like this, helpless, irritable. She didn't have the energy to do anything. And she was meant to head off to college in a week? Not a chance unless this thick brain fog lifted. There was so much preparation still to do, it was completely overwhelming. Mrs. Wilkerson, the housekeeper, did her laundry, brought her meals, changed her bedclothes. Wisteria felt like a burden. Her mother occasionally stopped by to deliver a new dress or hat and just to talk. That usually ended when her father picked a fight. Mother and father had been separated for 5 years now. Mrs. Charlotte Hackett lived in Ohio, in the house where Wisteria grew up, where the Hacketts resided before Robert left, or walked out on the family, depending on whom you asked, to work on the North Broadacre development. Mom had a boyfriend, and it was awkward. Wisteria had chosen to move in with her father, who offered her anything she wished, including this lush room, money to decorate any way she wanted, and a year off from school and responsibilities. Probably just a ploy to stick it to Mom, she thought. She rarely saw her father now. He was always working. The phone was ringing, her heavy black rotary phone. She picked up the receiver. Hello? It's Brock. She said. How's things? Nobody told you about Zane, I guess? Wisteria was suddenly afraid of Brock's tone. No, what's wrong? Well, I have some bad news. Brock's voice was wavering. There's no good way to tell it. Zane got hit by a car today. He's gone. He died. Wisteria sat up, plucked marzipan from her shoulder almost unconsciously, and tucked the animal back into her cage. Brock, I just talked to him this morning. It happened a couple of hours ago. They don't know. They don't know why exactly. They think he had been drinking, and they think he had his headphones on, and I guess he just wasn't paying attention. This can't be right. I don't know what to tell you. When Wisteria heard Brock sniffling on the other end of the phone, she couldn't hold back her own tears. He went to talk to my dad, she blurted out. It happened in North Broadacre. Did he make it to your dad's office? I don't know. A thought hit Wisteria suddenly. Oh, God, I heard the sirens earlier. A couple of streets over. I didn't even know what they were for. Yeah. Was it instantaneous? Brock tried to compose himself. He forced a response through spasmodic breath. He was hurt bad. He never regained consciousness. That's what they told me, anyway. Wisteria put a hand to her mouth and squeezed her eyes shut. She shook her head, remembering the angry conversation from earlier that day. There was a long pause when neither knew exactly how to proceed. So, I know you're not feeling good. Brock, oh my God. But everyone is meeting over at his parents' place. You're welcome to come, if you want to. Wisteria wiped away a fat tear that had rolled all the way down under her chin. I will. You don't have to, it's just an offer. I want to. Okay, it'd be good if you were there. I have to talk to my dad. Can you come and get me? I need half an hour. Wisteria burst into her father's office, carrying an unopened cardboard box with her name on it that had been lying against her front door. Kelly, the receptionist, didn't make any attempt to stop her. Zane Truax is dead, she said simply. Robert Hackett, who had been staring thoughtfully out the window, now swiveled his chair around to face his daughter. I know, honey. He rose to embrace her. Wisteria ignored his outstretched arms and slumped into the corner. You weren't planning to tell me then? I'll be honest, I didn't want to. He sat back down. I don't know how. With you feeling the way you have been lately, I didn't want to make things any worse. Did he speak with you this morning? Mr. Hackett nodded. And what happened? Wisteria, this is a sad time for all of us. Tell me what you talked about. He wanted me to stop the demolition of the schoolhouse. And? Wisteria was crying again. And I can't do that, so he decided that he was going to go out and put a stop to it himself. And he just happened to get hit by a car on the way there. Robert shrugged slightly. From what I was told, the Broadacre fire chief was on her way to the site. There was no time to stop. He wasn't looking, and he stepped out into the street. Wisteria shook her head and stared at the ceiling. Accidentally. Wisteria, they think he had been drinking. That's convenient, isn't it? She stared back at her father, big eyes blazing. You did this, didn't you? Honey, come on. You knew he'd try to stand in front of the demolition crew. You told them not to stop. It didn't even happen at the demolition site. Chief Ellsworth was driving down the street several blocks away. Probably just told her to run him down then. Make it look like an accident. Robert grimaced. You're not the only one affected by this. I don't care. I know you're upset. But listen, there's absolutely no way that I, or anyone else, could orchestrate something like that. There was a soft knock at the door, and Kelly popped her head in. A Mr. DeKalb is here for Wisteria, she said quietly before withdrawing. Wisteria and her father sat in silence for a few moments, not looking at each other. Finally, Robert Hackett spoke. I'm sorry, honey. Wisteria stood, slinging her purse over her shoulder and smoothing her wrinkled pants. Don't come to the funeral, she said. I don't want you there. It will be better for everyone. Then she left. Brock and Wisteria drove through the last gasp of a crimson Indiana sunset on the way to the southern edge of Broadacre, where the Truax family home awaited them. Far off at the back of a field, the powerful white lights of an enormous combine shone through a cloud of dust. A farmer was harvesting his corn. Wisteria stretched her arm through the truck's open window, idly rotating her hand through different angles and feeling the cool breeze of an early September evening. It was nice to be out of the house, she thought, but she wasn't looking forward to seeing Zane's relatives. You ever had anyone close to you pass away before? She asked Brock. My grandfather, he said, but we knew that was coming. You? Nope, not even a grandparent. What's in the box? Wisteria had been so preoccupied with her thoughts that she'd nearly forgotten about the box she picked up on the way out of the house. She turned it over and shrugged. I don't know. It has my name on it. Brock glanced at the box. That's Zane's handwriting. Quickly, Wisteria tore through the tape and read the note. He left it today. She stared at the words. The paper trembled in her hands. I called him this morning. We had kind of a fight. I guess he wanted to make it up to me. She pulled the dress out of the box and held it up. The thought struck her that Zane was no longer around to thank for the gift. Tears began to well up in her eyes again. What were you guys fighting about? Brock asked. I don't know. Dad yelled at me about the news article this morning, so I called and yelled at Zane. I tried to tell him not to go talk to my dad. Wish he'd listen to you. Where did he get this dress? Brock glanced at it. It didn't look familiar. No idea, he said. Brock turned into the Truax family's cul-de-sac and parked on the street behind another truck. There were quite a few other people here. Cars spilled out of the driveway and down both sides of the street. Zane's parents' house was a 1960s-era split level in an older neighborhood near the high school. Aunt Tamara greeted Brock and Wisteria at the door. She was a hugger. Surprisingly, it was somewhat more festive inside than Wisteria had imagined. Sure, there were tears here and there, handkerchiefs and tissue dabbing at eyes occasionally, but most everyone was smiling and nodding pleasantly, even Greg and Caroline. They were sharing happy memories of their son. Wisteria was the more outgoing of the two and jumped straight into the fray. She introduced herself to Zane's paternal grandmother, Beulah Higgins Truax. Bea told her all about the time Zane stayed overnight at her house and was allowed to eat popcorn and drink an entire diet soda by himself. He must have been about 5, and he was so excited. He stayed up until 10 o'clock watching an old black and white monster movie, which scared him to the point that he couldn't sleep. When he finally did pass out, he wet the bed. Wisteria couldn't help but giggle at the image. Brock, meanwhile, wandered the rooms and hallways of the Truax house, remembering. He went into the computer room on the lower floor where they used to play video games and create pictures on the screen with primitive graphics software. They'd spend hours hunt and pecking basic language programs from magazines. The space had been converted years ago into Caroline's hobby room, with plastic tubs of fabric and a big sewing machine in the corner. Brock closed the door and lifted a heavy wooden frame from its nail. There, in the wall, were dozens of half-inch vertical gouges. He and Zane used to throw a knife at a piece of corrugated cardboard with Jean Norris's picture taped to it. Jean had been pursued by both Zane and Brock at different points during high school, and she had shot down their aspirations. That made her a good target for their mutual derision. Problem was that the knife, on the rare occasions when it did actually find its mark rather than bouncing harmlessly off the wall, usually penetrated deeper than the cardboard backing and cut into the drywall. They didn't notice the problem until they spontaneously decided to swap out Jean's picture with the photo of another, now forgotten, object of unrequited passion, and found the holes arranged like the scatter pattern from a buckshot shell. Zane, thinking quickly, took down the impromptu dartboard and hung a family portrait in front of the damaged section of wall. It worked, because here was the evidence of their crime so many years later. No one ever found out. Brock smiled as he rehung the picture. Each throw was the record of one particular moment in time. A bored afternoon here, a frustration there, a challenge, a dare. He couldn't remember specifics any longer, but the feelings of that time came rushing back. He could smell slightly burned microwave popcorn, glossy paper of high school textbooks, the prickly scent of cleaning chemicals on countertops, cut grass, damp mulch wafting through an open window near the ceiling, body odor, cheap aftershave, hot, humid summer air, tire rubber. Then there were the tastes: macaroni and cheese, microwaved bean burritos after school, canned green beans, baked potatoes, and chicken fried steak with gravy at meals with the Truax family, chips, salsa during late nights in front of the computer. He could even recall the sounds of the bands they used to listen to: novelty tunes, distorted psychedelic rap, geeky rock bands with ironically sincere accordion players, bizarro covers of popular rock, punkified oldies, lounge versions of modern top 40 hits, the songs of 70s crooners butchered by Japanese rockers with a weak grasp of the original language. Brock tried in vain to remember specific afternoons, but everything had faded to a soup of impressions and feelings, brief candles illuminating only snatches of conversation or particularly emotional moments. Then he felt an ache inside his chest, a longing for a time past. He wanted it back. Nostalgia. Sometimes he felt it quickly, even happily. Sometimes he heard a snatch of electronic music that reminded him of an old game, and he wished he still had his old 8-bit computer, the one he knew inside and out. Other times it was a wish for the simple, regimented school days that he wanted when life became stressful. But he couldn't have those things back, and it was uncomfortable. His childhood was never coming back, and that sense of certainty was never coming back. And now his friend was never coming back. Time was moving faster and faster. The past year seemed to have taken only half as long as the one before it. If his perception of time kept increasing at this geometric pace, he'd be on his deathbed before he knew it. Brock was 24 now. In one more year, he'd be 25, and if he lived out a full, average human lifespan of 75 years, he was already 1/3 of the way to being dead. But then, he couldn't even count on an average lifespan, could he? Zane hadn't made it to 25. Was his time coming? For all Brock knew, there could be some terrible accident awaiting him at the end of the week. The thought made him dizzy, and he put a hand against the wall to steady himself. Panic. There it was again, his constant follower. He might be outrunning it at one moment, sometimes for weeks or months on end, but he could never escape it completely. It would catch up easily at his weakest moments, taking the opportunity to make a bad situation even worse. Am I going to pass out? Thought Brock. His heart raced. My heart's beating too fast. Someone's going to find me unconscious in here. They're going to wonder what I was doing in here by myself. Zane's parents, they don't need this. They don't need to be worried about me when they're already grieving for their son. I'm a real asshole. Brock went back out into the hallway, willing his wobbly legs to work and expending more than the usual concentration required just to keep his balance. He took a deep, stuttering breath and tried to calm the heart thumping against his ribcage. It's just a panic attack. This will pass. Like it always does. But it wouldn't. It was getting worse. Brock could hear lively conversations from the living room, so he went the other way. He pictured his own heart bursting in front of all Zane's relatives and him slumping dead to the floor while everyone screamed. Down the progressively darkening hallway, feeling his way along the walls. He pulled open a door at the end and slipped into Zane's old room. He wasn't sure why he had picked this room. Maybe it was a combination of morbid curiosity, nostalgia, and fear. He needed a place to be alone. The room was still painted the same shade of seafoam green that it had been since at least the early 80s. Zane moved all of his belongings to Broadview Manor, so the room was empty but for traces that can't be immediately cleaned away. Spots on the walls where posters used to hang were framed by faint, dirty smudges. In the far corner, hooks that once supported plastic spaceship models on strings were screwed into the textured ceiling. The taupe carpet was threadbare in several places. Near the door, beneath a single small window, and in the middle of the room where the edge of Zane's bed used to be, where his feet would hit the floor every morning upon waking. Brock lay upon the floor. Sometimes this helped. He put his hands on his stomach and tried to breathe slowly, rhythmically. He stared into the pure white globe of the light fixture in the middle of the ceiling. Just breathe. His heart rate spiked again. Maybe there's really something wrong this time. Maybe I got a disease from living in the hoarder house. Maybe I inhaled some asbestos. Or some kind of mold that's taken root in my lung. Maybe I should call an ambulance. The door opened a crack. It was Wisteria. What's wrong? Brock closed his eyes. I hope it's maybe just a panic attack. Wisteria stepped inside and shut the door. Not surprised. It's been a rough day. It won't stop, though, said Brock. I'm really not sure if I might be dying this time. You're not dying. Wisteria sat down on the carpet next to Brock. You need to get out of your own head for a while. I may need you to drive me to the hospital, man. I will if you need me to, but your friend died. You're stressed out. It's painfully obvious to anyone who isn't you that it's just a panic attack. Brock rolled over and covered his head with his hands. Okay, then leave me alone and I'll wait it out. Nope. She pushed Brock over onto his back again. You need to get up and do something. I don't want to. Let's get you focused on something else. Something besides the anxiety. I don't feel like being social with all the relatives right now. Not that. I want to go out. Where to? I want to go, she said slowly, to the place where Zane died. Brock was quiet for a moment. Then he sat up. You think you're going to see his ghost? I don't know, but you remember the night you caught me leaving wine at the hoarder house? He said that if he ever passed on, he would find a way to communicate from the other side. No, you said that. Well, he agreed with it. I'm sure he would want to say goodbye at least. I don't know. Come on, you'll feel better. I promise. She dragged Brock to his feet without giving him a chance to protest. Fine. You're driving, though. At the crossroads where Maine met Verna, they waited beneath a blood-red harvest moon, full and pregnant in the clear sky. Wisteria had been correct. Brock's panic subsided during the car ride. It was crowded out by disturbing thoughts of what they might see in the dark. Not a huge improvement, but a step in the right direction. Wisteria had parked Brock's truck along the curb, directly across the street from the empty North Broadacre Cemetery, and they crawled into the truck bed, sitting up against the sidewalls, legs crossed. Hundreds of crickets and cicadas called out stridently, with no rhythm or structure to their communal opus, stepping on each other's toes with their songs, like an orchestra tuning up. So far, Brock and Wisteria hadn't seen anything, though they strained against the night to catch a glimpse of Zane's specter. They had no idea what form it might take. A transparent, full-body apparition? A glowing orb? Would the ghost look the way Zane had looked in life? Would it be mangled and gory? I just hope, if he really is watching, that he doesn't think we're being weird by coming out here, Brock said. I don't think so, said Wisteria. The dead have no ego. I read that somewhere. What does that even mean? It means the dead don't have any sense of self. No specific self-identity. If you could do anything, go anywhere, then an ego would just hold you back. You wouldn't care what anyone thinks of you, and with no body, no pain, no hurt, no self-consciousness, what would you care what anyone else does? Sounds like a bunch of crap. Wisteria shrugged. Believe what you want, then. Do you think he is watching us? Right now? Wisteria tucked a hank of curly hair behind her ear in order to allow all the sounds of the night to enter. She closed her eyes. Yes. Wisteria was sitting close to Brock, her shoulder touching his. No worries for the personal space of others, just like always. Maybe she was scared, and the touch of another human was comforting. Maybe she was cold and just wanted to conserve body heat. Maybe there was some other reason. A soft breeze chilled her. Brock was picking absently at the cuticle of his thumb with the nail of his middle finger. He did this sometimes when he was nervous. Without even noticing, he cut too deeply and blood began to well up. Do you feel it? She asked. Brock tried. He even closed his eyes, but no. All he felt was the chilly night air and the goosebumps rising on his skin. Even though someone was watching them. From a tall window in the large white church's belfry, a figure was staring down at the pair. A figure in a black clerical stroked his thin beard and watched. Reverend Terry Cleghorn was always watching, and his tower was the perfect place from which to observe. No one would ever spot him up there in the dark. I got nothing, Brock said. I'm not sure I believe any of this anyway. I'd love to know that Zane's still out there, but what if he's really just gone? Wisteria sighed. Even after the voice we heard, you still don't think there's any reason to believe in an afterlife. Actually, I was the one who said, get out, in the old farmhouse. Wisteria looked Brock dead in the face, her eyes wide and searching. What? He nodded. It was me. It was a joke. No, it didn't sound like you. Brock said it again, rumbling the words around the back of his throat. Get out. It was just as Wisteria remembered. Her mouth hung open crookedly. Did you ever tell Zane? No. Brock sucked on the edge of his bloody thumb. The voice, that changed his whole outlook. That's why I didn't tell him. It made him happy to believe in it. Well, that's depressing. Why? Because it was based on a lie. There was a brief squeaking sound in the distance, like bed springs shifting under a sleeper's weight. Wisteria turned back to look for something, anything, in the night. Zane? She called. Are you there? Only the rustling wind in the trees responded. I'm not sure that matters, said Brock. It does matter. It wasn't the truth. A car went by. After its red taillights disappeared into the distance, Wisteria spoke again into the darkness. I liked the dress you left for me. No response. Brock watched her face. Moonlight glinted in the tears that were beginning to pool in Wisteria's eyes again. He knew that she wanted to believe so badly that Zane was out there and hoped against hope that something would happen. For her sake. I'm sorry I yelled at you this morning, she said. There was nothing. Brock looked away from the tear that had broken free and slipped down Wisteria's cheek. Across the street and up a hill, he could see a black silhouette of the schoolhouse that was still standing. You did it, man, Brock called. He felt a little odd. Spiritual displays had never suited him. But what could it hurt? That old schoolhouse is still there. Wisteria sniffed and smiled, drying her wet face with a shirt sleeve. They waited, watching in silence, for another 15 minutes. Finally, Wisteria spoke quietly. Well, shall we be off? Brock straightened stiffly. Yeah, my back is in serious pain right now. They climbed out, stretched, and piled into the truck's cab, Wisteria in the driver's seat. She sat thinking for a minute with the key in the ignition. I don't want to drive you all the way to Broadacre tonight. Will you come back to my place? I have a pull-out bed you can sleep on. Brock pursed his lips. Won't your dad kill me? Won't Mike kill me? Wisteria smiled. I'll sneak you in. No funny business. I think it's better for you not to be all alone in that house tonight anyway. I guess, he said. We gotta be careful, though. Wisteria eased down the accelerator, and the truck rattled off. In the still night air, The gate in the white picket fence surrounding the cemetery swung open silently on oiled hinges for no particular reason. Brock's truck clattered down the street past the Hackett Associates building with Wisteria peering out the driver's side window. A light was burning in her father's office. "He's working," she said. "Mrs. Wilkerson will be gone. We can make it if we go now." Wisteria U-turned at the end of the street and headed back to the bank. She circled the block and parked in an alley next to the Italian restaurant's dumpster. "I'm going to get towed," Brock said. "I'll call the night watchman and ask for a favor. Come on." She ran across the street, giggling, with Brock close behind. The second floor was dark. Wisteria opened the glass door with her key and headed upstairs. Brock looked over the family pictures along the wall as they ascended. He saw Wisteria as a bald, chubby-cheeked baby. There were pictures of her as a little girl, riding a tricycle. Then, grade school pictures, the cheesy 80s kind, with neon pink stripes and a floating three-quarter view disembodied head behind the primary portrait. Robert Hackett was giving Wisteria a ride upon his shoulders in one picture. There were a couple of high school prom photos. Wisteria was being escorted by a different guy in each. "There you are!" Brock nearly jumped out of his skin. An older gray-haired woman was standing at the top of the stairs, squinting in the light. "Mrs. Wilkerson." Wisteria froze in mid-step. "I thought you'd gone home." The woman shook her head. "Your father asked me to stay and make sure you got back okay." "I'm fine." Wisteria motioned to Brock. This is my friend, Brock. He's going to stay here tonight." Mrs. Wilkerson ushered the two up the stairs and into the kitchen. She gave Brock the once-over, frowning. "Wisteria, you know your father wouldn't approve of boys staying over." Zane was Brock's best friend, and his roommate. "I'm sorry for your loss, Brock," Mrs. Wilkerson said. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that." Mrs. Wilkerson sighed. "I have to send you home, though. Mr. Hackett would throw a fit. You understand, right?" Wisteria took Mrs. Wilkerson's hand in hers. "I need a big favor." "No. Your father would be furious with me." "He lost his best friend today. Don't make him go back to that big old house all by himself." "Wisteria, come on. Don't put me in that position." Downstairs, there was a jangling of keys outside the front door. Wisteria's eyes went wide. "Mrs. Wilkerson, please. Dad won't even know." "Wisteria." A key turned in the lock. "He'll be gone in the morning. No funny business. He just needs our support." Mrs. Wilkerson looked at Brock once again as the door opened on the first floor. She shook her head. Then she whispered, "Fine. Your father had better not find out." Wisteria shoved Brock in the direction of her bedroom and pointed. "Go," she hissed. Brock stole away and closed the door behind him. He could hear muffled voices on the other side as he looked around the space that looked more like an earthquake in an antique store than a bedroom. To his right, a taxidermied weasel or ferret fought with a snake, frozen forever in battle on a log perch. There was a burgundy fez on the dresser. Creepy porcelain dolls. A large moth encased in acrylic resin. Empty glass bottles with cracking and faded labels. A fencing mask. Old-time photographs. A cookie jar in the shape of a pig with a particularly evil smile on its face. Some sort of animal was scuttling around in a cage covered by a blanket. Brock found himself hoping that Wisteria returned quickly. Soon enough, the voices faded and Wisteria entered the room with a grin, locking the door behind her. "Close call, right? How do you like my room?" "You got a lot of crazy stuff." Wisteria rolled out a trundle bed and pulled a couple of heavy quilts from her closet. "What's in the cage?" Brock asked. "That's Marzipan. She's a sugar glider. Kind of like a flying squirrel." Wisteria opened the cage and extracted her pet, setting it down on Brock's shoulder. Marzipan climbed all the way up Brock's head and settled in his frizzy hair. Wisteria laughed at Brock's terrified expression. "She likes you." Wisteria gave the little animal a piece of dried fruit and put her back in the cage. Brock kicked off his shoes and crawled into bed, while Wisteria turned out all of the lights except a low wattage lamp with an intricate stained glass shade on her bedside table. She went into her closet, closed the door, and emerged wearing a floor-length Victorian nightgown. Yawning, she slipped beneath the covers of her own bed. "Are you tired?" she asked. "Yeah, it's been a long day." Brock rolled over and closed his eyes. "I'm glad you're here." "Me too." A few minutes later, she whispered, "You asleep?" "Nah." "What are you thinking about?" "Not much." "Zane?" "Yeah." "I'm afraid of the funeral. I don't want to go," Wisteria said. "How come?" "I don't want to see his body." "You don't have to look if you don't want to." "And all his family, everybody's going to be crying, and I'm going to be crying in front of a bunch of strangers. I won't know what to say." "Stick with me. I'll take care of you." "And what if someone hears about my dad and the fight and everything that happened?" "They won't. It wasn't your dad's fault. Or your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault." There was a long silence. "Brock?" "Yeah?" "You're the best." "You're pretty okay too. You're like the annoying little sister I never had." Wisteria smiled and closed her eyes. 2 days later, Zane was laid to rest. He became the first person buried in the North Broadacre Cemetery. Robert Hackett donated a plot to the Truax family. Services were held in the white church at the center of North Broadacre. That was Robert's idea also. Reverend Terry Cleghorn presided over the funeral. He was a boisterous man and projected his voice to the back of the church, even though only the first 4 rows of pews were filled. The sermon revolved around the idea of rest, how we need physical rest because we work without ceasing all our lives. We need emotional rest too, because of stress, fear, and anger. And then we need spiritual rest because we have no peace in God due to everyone being a sinner and all. Both Wisteria and Brock thought that last part was kind of a stretch and didn't really make sense, but they didn't say anything. The funeral program stated that in lieu of flowers, contributions can be made to the Hauser's Wood Cemetery Upkeep Fund. That's a nice touch, Brock thought. He wondered who was running the fund. The Reverend spoke about Zane and his life, hitting brief highlights from the time he was born through his work with Hauser's Wood Cemetery. His face grew solemn. His gestures were subdued. He went on to tell of what a loss had been sustained by Zane's family, his friends, and the whole community, how he would be missed, and how he was loved by those who were left behind. There was weeping in the audience, but Reverend Cleghorn continued, waving his arms exuberantly, proclaiming that Zane had been saved and that he was with God now. He spoke of the blood of Christ and sacrifice and love. He assured the audience that everyone would see Zane again someday in heaven, if they believed. Later, after the service and interment, Brock and Wisteria stood together at the open grave as the assembled mourners milled about, hugging and crying. They looked down into the dark, hollow cavity in the earth. Behind them, Reverend Cleghorn was a reassuring presence to those assembled at the graveside, several of whom told him how much they enjoyed his sermon and what a wonderful way he had with words. "You always know just what to say, Reverend," said Robert Hackett's secretary, Kelly, who had been sent in his place. "It sure is a gift." "I'm just the Lord's mouthpiece," replied the Reverend. After the Reverend had wandered off, Wisteria asked Brock, "Did Zane even believe in all the religious stuff that Reverend Cleghorn talked about in his sermon?" Brock shook his head. "Nah, not since he was a kid, as far as I know." "I didn't think so." "But the funeral isn't really for Zane anyway." "It's for his parents, and family and friends, for the people who are still alive, to make them feel better." Wisteria continued to stare into the pit. "Did the Reverend ask you for any stories about Zane?" "Nope. You?" No. Brock and Wisteria waited at the grave together, long past the time that everyone else had gone. They weren't quite sure what to say to each other. Brock was glad for her company, though, as his brain quietly tried to reorient itself to life without his friend. Eventually the sky began to darken and they parted. By Sunday, Wisteria was gone, packed up and shipped off to college, and Brock was all alone.